dedicated to each and every one of you who appreciate a great glass of wine. You know what I mean?
It's Monday. Let's raise a glass to the beginning of another week. It's time to unscrew, uncork, or savor a bottle. And let's begin exploring the wine glass. Sometimes the stars align and an accident happens that turns into a great opportunity. I had reached out to West Sonoma Coast AVA for some information, and about 2 weeks later, I received an email from Cleo Pahlmeyer. Now, although I knew who she was, I didn't know why she was reaching out. As it turns out, there was some miscommunication with the AVA's association, but it opened the door for this incredible interview with Cleo and her Wayfarer Vineyard. Please take a moment to rate and review the podcast. Did you know you can do it right now? Like literally right now while you're listening. New ratings and reviews are how the algorithms decide which podcasts they recommend to others. And if you love the podcast, other wine lovers will too. And please don't forget to add your email address to the newsletter list on the website at exploringthewineglass.com to keep up to date on all things Exploring the Wine Glass. Blancha. Hey everybody, I'm Lori Budd, the UC Davis winemaking program, Spanish wine scholar, sommelier service, champagne and Côte d'Aron specialist, and a WSET Level 2 graduate. You can find Exploring the Wine Glass on all the socials, as well as your favorite podcast catchers. If you haven't subscribed yet, now's the perfect time to swipe, subscribe, rate, and review. Stay in the know about all things wine by visiting my website, exploringthewineglass.com. I promise I'll never tell you what to drink, but I'll always share what's in my glass.
You are special.
Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Allure of the Poor, sponsored by Dracaena Wines. I am your host, Lori, and today I am virtually traveling to West Sonoma Coast, and we are with Cleo Pahlmeyer, and I'm very excited to try these wines, so welcome.
Thank you. Thanks so much for the opportunity.
Yes, and I have to start off with, I'll let everybody know we kind of met through email by accident or whatever, and it's like a happy accident. I was like, oh, look at here, and I was like, I don't know, what can we talk about? There's so much between your family and what you have done and everything. So it wasn't an easy task to finite those questions down a bit. But we're going to focus on your project of Wayfarer. And I am thrilled to have 2 bottles. So we are going to do a vertical. I have a 2019 I always do it backwards, Wayfarer. And then we have the 2020 Wayfarer. And these are both Fort Ross Seaview, Sonoma County AVA. So before we get into it, I just want to, share people with my first question is always the origin story. So you have an interesting origin story, how you got into wine. So can you share that with us?
Of course. Yeah, it starts with my dad and his love of wine. He grew up in Northern California in Oakland, and so wine country was never too far away. He started out pursuing a law career, but he always said, I found myself reading more wine journals than law journals. Well, go figure. And so these days it would be listening to more wine podcasts, law podcasts. And so he just fell in love with wine and started pursuing it. My grandfather introduced him to wines by taking him to France, and they visited Champagne and Bordeaux, and then that's where he really started to get the wine bug. Fast forward a little bit, and he left his law career and started Pahlmeyer Winery in Napa. In the 86 was the first vintage. Our first winemaker for Pahlmeyer was Randy Dunn, followed by Helen Turley in the 90s. And so in that period, in the 90s, my dad started to get more and more into Pinot Noir. His first love was Bordeaux, and his dream was to make his own Mouton, which he did with the Pahlmeyer proprietary red. But he always says every enophile eventually gravitates to the wines of Burgundy. And so Helen, of course, made her name making cult Cabernets, but is probably better known today for her own Marquesan label, which is Pinot Noir and Chardonnay from a vineyard not too far from Wayfarer now. And so, so she introduced my dad to a property for sale not far from Marquesan, like I said, in what's now the new West Sonoma Coast AVA. It's also the more smaller AVA that we're also in is called Fort Ross Seaview. And the West Sonoma Coast is kind of around us now. And so she introduced him to this property and brought my dad out there, and he just fell in love. So this region is truly coastal. When you hear Sonoma Coast, it really, I mean, it can go very far inland as far as Carneros, which, borders Napa. And so a lot of the areas of the Sonoma Coast are not cool wine growing regions. They're actually quite warm wine growing regions. And so where we are in Fort Ross Seaview and the greater West Sonoma Coast is truly cool wine growing region. And up in the northern coastal mountain range where Fort Ross Seaview is, we are close to the ocean. So Wayfarer is 4 miles from the Pacific. Some of the vineyards in this region are much closer, 2 miles or less. And so the proximity to the coast is really important, but then also elevation plays a huge role here. Anybody that's ever driven along, the famous Highway 1 on the California coast knows that, as soon as you start to head inland, you're climbing up the mountains, and and this road hugs these mountains along its way up the coast. So so the vineyards are planted along the ridge lines above the fog line. If below the fog line is where redwood forests thrive, and above the fog line is a relatively new region for growing wine. And so my dad planted the vineyard, bought the land and planted the vineyard. He got David Abreu to plant the vineyard. It's still to this day the only Sonoma vineyard that David Abreu has developed, and started harvesting fruit in 2005, which we were blending into our Pahlmeyer Pinot Noir and Chardonnay at the time. And I started working with my dad in 2008, and as I got to know the vineyard more than just a place that he would take me drives and go out there for weekends, and as I got to know the wines, I started advocating with my family and the company to create an estate label, because we were blending the fruit with other Russian River vineyards. But if you think about the great wines of the world, they're not from a blend of various vineyards. They're from one truly special site, and Wayfarer had definitely become that. And so when the vineyard was 10 years old in 2012, we harvested our first vintage that would be Wayfarer. And so now today, my family sold Pahlmeyer at the end of 2019, but we held on to Wayfarer, and I'm actually the only family member that's still involved in the business. So
carrying on the legacy.
Yeah, so carrying that on. I sold the business for my family, and then with Wayfarer, I have the pleasure of being able to focus on this really small project with a really tight team, majority of whom have been with me for almost 10 years now, since we were part of Pahlmeyer, and get to focus on what I'm really passionate about, something that I got to start, as opposed to just carrying on what I was doing with Pahlmeyer, which my dad started.
And so you actually, I'm curious because you studied art history, which is so cool. I mean, I love art, and the history behind it is the history of how these artists made the painting and how they came around is so intriguing to me. But when you were studying that, you obviously were like, yeah, I'm not doing wine, so I'm going in this different route. So what was your career process, goal when you were studying art history?
Well, I have to say that I didn't think very much about where it would lead me. I focused on was my dad thought, Cleo, you should, go to the business school, or, get an undergraduate business degree or something like that. And my mother told me, just study what you're passionate about. So I clearly took my mother's advice. But ultimately, when I graduated, what I really wanted was a career in business. And I was able to, after, doing a few other things, I was able to find that through working with my dad. So that's kind of how I got from my education into business. But, I think there's lots of business professionals in the world today that learned everything they know about what they do in their job through their job.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that in previous, like decades ago, like, my parents and their parents, well, maybe not their parents because they didn't go to college, but, those previous generations, they went to college to do specifically what they went to college for. And I don't think that's true anymore. I think people go to college to experience more so the college experience and learn this, learn that. And I think today more people are finding this is what I went to college for, but that's not really what I'm passionate about. And I'm going to find a way to adapt that to what I'm really passionate about. So I don't think you're alone in that at all. I think many people have gone to college for one thing and, found a different route to it, to what they're doing. And, you have to be passionate about it. Otherwise, it's kind of dreadful.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yes.
So you came in kind of with, like a wrecking ball thing. You were named one of the 40 under 40s. So when you first got into the industry, you must have made quite the hit for your own name. And sometimes I think it might be difficult when you have the generation above you who has made such a name for themselves to make a name for yourself, but you've done that. So congratulations. How did that feel?
Well, is one of the things that really drove me to get involved with the winery was because my dad was expressing he wanted to step back more than he had already. And he wanted to step back and retire. And I thought, well, if you don't have the family at the helm and really driving the vision of a business like this, it loses its soul. It loses its reason for being, what made it great in the first place. And so when I stepped into that role in the winery, there had been a significant period of time where there was nobody there. My dad was out front, through the 80s, 90s, but by the 2000s, he had taken a step back. You can only go at that pace for so long. And so we were really building the brand back up a lot at that point and putting a lot of intentional effort into that. And so that was my role in stepping out into that and being sort of the new front person, I guess, for the brand. And then on internally, then also taking it to the next level as an organization, and as far as our winemaking and viticulture, as far as the quality of the product that we were making.
So let's go back to the vineyard itself, the Wayfarer vineyard. Helen Turley found it kind of for you guys, right? So it was kind of an off the grid vineyard, which I don't know if any vineyard was on the grid back then, but what was meant by off the grid vineyard?
Well, it was owned by a couple of hippies that have moved out to this super rural area as part of the Back to the Land movement. And, so this area has like cattle ranches and then, just huge parcels owned by, somebody it's been in the family for generations. And so there's not much happening out in this area, aside from cattle ranching, and in the past, a lot more logging, of course. This couple, the Davises, there was no vineyard, but they had an organic farm and would sell their produce to local restaurants. Like one of them was Chez Panisse, which is known as being like the pioneering farm to table restaurant in the US. And they also ran a school for children that, whose parents didn't know what to do with them. and raise animals and things like that. So so very much off the grid, you know, composting toilets. There's electric. They were technically on the grid. There's electricity. And so when my dad, when my dad just fell in love with it, you know, he saw like the produce that they were growing out there and thought, well, they can ripen these beautiful fruits and vegetables this close to the coast in this climate, then I know we can make great Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. So then he bought the land and then developed the vineyard. So it's just 30 acres planted to Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. And just this year we harvested our first half acre of Syrah. So we're trying out a little bit of Syrah out there because there's some cool climate Syrah producers in this region and other places that are making really great wines. And so we wanted to see what we could do at Wayfarer. So TBD, but the first Syrah is in barrel.
Okay.
So we planted the Pinot Noir and Chardonnay out there, just 30 acres. And so all the wines that we make are just from our one vineyard on the coast.
And how did you, so again, you know, Helen Turley's vineyard is nearby. She saw that it went on the market. She let your father know. When your father came and fell in love with it, what is that to walk up to a vineyard that's, how big is the site? Because you're planted to 30 acres, but it's larger than that.
Yeah, but it's actually not that big of a parcel. It's just 70-acre parcel.
Okay.
And that's unusual for this area. Generally, the parcels are hundreds of acres, large. So when he found it, it was really like the cool air, and then the elevation really brings what my dad calls luminosity, like that quality of sunlight. That's really important. Well, it's really important in tannin development. Because even with Pinot Noir, which isn't, you don't think Pinot Noir and tannins necessarily, but obviously it's a really important aspect of any wine, any red wine. And so, that elevation and the quality of the light enhances the skin tannins in the wine. So,
and you're in love with Burgundy. So when you see this land and you see the soils, I've got to find this because I loved this. So on your website, it says, Burgundians may boast their vaunted Cameroonian limestones, Germans of their slate, the Chateauvians of their rounded stones, Sonomans slap the Gold Ridge trump card down and reach for the chips. So I love it. But yeah, I don't know what Gold Ridge is. So can you explain that?
Yeah. So this soil is really famous in Russian River, and it's pretty ubiquitous throughout Russian River, which has long been a very highly acclaimed and respected Pinot Noir growing region. And so it's a sandy loam. So it's a mix of sand and clay, and it's from the it's pushed up from ancient, sea floor. And so it's very well draining, which is particularly important where we are at Wayfarer, because this climate in this region, we've been talking about drought, but our typical rainfall is over 60 inches.
I saw that. Oh my goodness.
So it's a coastal rainforest is the climate. And so it's really important. I mean, in a drought year, we'll get more like 20 inches, but we're lucky that we don't have water issues because our pond will fill up with just 20 inches of rain.
Wow.
So that's good. But yeah, so it's very well draining, but there is enough clay content that it retains moisture, and then there's a sandstone substrate. So so we've been very lucky. We haven't had to pull any vines since the vineyard was planted, and so everything is still it's on over 20-year rootstock at this point. And so in the Gold Ridge soil is also interesting because in Fort Ross Seaview there's a great diversity of soils, but Gold Ridge isn't one that's very common, and so it's actually really unique to have this Gold Ridge soil on our site, and it's also very uniform, which there's so many different aspects in viticulture. It's nice to have a more uniform soil, but, there's a lot of interesting vineyards where in this region where winemakers have done a lot of work to try to understand, they may have 6 or 7 different soil types just in their one, 30-acre vineyard. But we have really great uniformity on the site as far as soil. But we also have both east and west facing aspects, and lots of diversity within the site, just not with the soil.
So the east-west would be important with all of that rainfall, so that it can, right? Because that's a lot of rainfall. So
so we have the west facing aspect is more gently sloping, and then both the east facing aspects are pretty steep. So that also is very important too with that amount of rainfall.
And so in these vineyards, it's planted on the King Ridge, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, and you're talking about this rainfall. So are you on and I can always forget which is which, windward or whatever, but like one side of the mountain gets the rain and then the mountain stops the rain and the other side doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
So you're on the side that the rain comes in, because once it hits the top, right, the rest of
in this region, it's a little bit more, so in Napa Valley, it's really easy to see, or it's easy to see, but it's if you're just looking up the valley, you can see that the western mountain range is very green, and then the eastern mountain range is very dry and just small, shrubby trees. And so you can see that clearly the western mountain range gets a lot more rain, and then that moisture doesn't quite make it all the way over to the western side. But in Fort Ross Seaview, there's 2 ridge lines that run along the coast. So the vineyards in this region, vineyards are either planted on the first ridge line or the second ridge line. And so we're on the second ridge line. So we're a little bit more protected from, I think both ridge lines get similar amounts of moisture. It's more protected from the more breeze and cold. So we're a little bit warmer and a little bit less, breeze coming through. So a little bit more favorable when you're looking at set and bloom and things like that. But being on the second ridge line means we're a little bit more protected from the elements. But I'd say we get similar rainfall.
Okay. And so what about Pinot Noir and Chardonnay just makes your heart aflutter? Like, why these two?
Yeah. Well, so, I have to say that similar to my dad, my tastes in wines have evolved and are still evolving, of course. But I just love Chardonnay and Pinot Noir for so many reasons. I'll start with, both of them are so versatile as far as enjoying just on their own or with meals. And in particular, I have to say that I'm a huge Chardonnay fan. It's a very expensive habit, though, I have to say, because any people that I meet that say they don't really love Chardonnay, it's easy to find not great Chardonnays. And you have to seek out and pay a little bit more for the really great Chardonnays of the world. But when you do have a really world-class Chardonnay in your glass, I find that there's few things better in life. It is an expensive habit, though. But Chardonnay is just, it can be consumed with so many different meals, from, of course, what you would think of like fish dishes or crab or lobster, to a roast chicken or a beautiful pork dish. It just has so much body and volume, but also with that beautiful acidity in the wines. And that's also what I look for in Pinot Noir. I look for that volume in the mouth and that length, but then also the energy in the wines. And with wines, that's what I really look for in a quality wine. Not obviously they have to have beautiful aromatics, but the specific aromatics that you're smelling and tasting aren't, to me, as important as the textural and the components and the feel of the wine. And to me, the acidity and the tannin well, those things that go into the structure of a wine are a feel. And anyway, so I love Pinot Noir and Chardonnay for that reason, because they have so much versatility, but they have so much to offer, but always with energy. At least if they're good, they have to have that energy to make you take the next sip. You know, like I've had Cabernets that are rated 100 points, and I don't want to take more than one sip, because it's like you know, sharing a super rich chocolate mousse at dinner. It's like you can only have so much of that.
Right. Okay. Well, this, I'm sitting here and I'm swirling, and the aromatics are so pronounced that they're like, I mean, the people who are listening to the podcast aren't going to be able to see this, but it's a good, hand away from my face, and I'm swirling. And as I'm swirling, the aromatics are in, coming up, and I'm like, oh, okay, I'm going to have to taste this. I was going to wait, but no, I'm going to have to taste this.
Well, and that's another thing about Pinot Noir and Chardonnay too, is that they tend to be, or especially Pinot Noir, they just such incredible range of aromatics in those wines. And like, I love it when I just stick my nose in the glass and my mouth is already watering.
Mm-hmm.
That's how I know it's going to be a great wine.
So this is the 2019. How do you process your Chardonnay? And then, but we're going to get more after we talk about the processing. I want to dive into clones, because I am so geeky about clones. But just general processing for the 2019. You harvest looking for what specs, and on your, I think all great winemakers are walking the vineyards. They're not, chemistry is fantastic, but I think the final decision is the mouth. So what are you looking for when it comes time to harvest? And then how are you processing it from taking it from the vineyard into the winery? And now a word from our sponsor. Exploring the Wine Glass is brought to you by Dracaena Wines. Dracaena Wines is an artisan winery located in Paso Robles, California. They have been producing wine since 2013. Their first vintage began with one wine, their classic Cabernet Franc, which received a 91 in Wine Enthusiast. Since then, they have increased production as well as expanded their portfolio, have received many accolades, including multiple double gold medals and consistent 90-plus ratings. Visit their website, www.dracaenawines.com, or use the link in the show notes to schedule a private tasting and to see their entire portfolio. Purchase your award-winning wine and let Dracaena Wines help turn your moments into great memories.
So our winemaker is Todd Cohn, and he's been with Pahlmeyer since, started with Pahlmeyer with Wayfarer, though, since the first vintage was in barrel, and then became head winemaker in 2018, or at the end of 2017. And so with you just mentioned clones, and so that makes a big difference, because as far as the chemistry of the fruit at harvest, we look for different things in different clones. Like we have one Chardonnay clone that where we were waiting a little bit longer, you'll have some higher bricks, but because that's the clone that really brings that fleshiness to the wine and the density. And then we have another clone that we harvest at a different chemistry, because that clone just tastes better with lower bricks. That's the clone that brings more of that acidity and minerality to the wine. So we harvest at night, starting at 10 p.m. and we'll go through to the morning. So the fruit will then arrive. So we're very, very remote. That's one thing I haven't mentioned yet, is Wayfarer from Santa Rosa, where our winery is. It's 90 minutes. And so a 90-minute drive to get
You've got to travel when it's cold.
Exactly. And so the fruit will arrive at the winery first thing in the morning and be processed. So we'll sort the clusters, and then they'll go directly into a bladder press or a champagne press. And then our winemaker is there always on site to make the press cuts, which are very important. So he'll taste the juice as it's coming out. And then he'll make a couple different cuts and separate those lots. And that's really important because if you're pressing too much, you can get you'll get more juice, but you'll get flavors that we don't want.
Because you're doing, for the whites, you're doing a whole cluster.
Exactly. And so then we'll put that juice into stainless steel tanks and let it settle overnight, because obviously all the skins and the clusters have all sorts of sediment and stuff on them. And then we'll rack that juice to all French oak barrels, about 50% neutral, 50% new. Okay. In the 2019, there's a little bit more new oak, maybe more like 60%. And then the bottom of that stainless steel tank, once all of the juice has been put to barrel, are the lees, and it's these kind of yellowy, orangey sediment that comes off the grape. So we'll take the good lees and then put a little bit in each barrel.
Oh, okay, nice.
So that really helps. I mean, it adds to the wine and the body of the wine, and so then the wine will go through alcoholic fermentation and 100% malolactic fermentation. We'll stir the lees through alcoholic fermentation, and then cut down significantly on the stirring through malolactic fermentation, and then the wine stays in barrel. We'll do the blends in March usually, and then so all the wine will then get blended together in a tank and then put back into barrel until December. And then we'll bottle in December. So it's 15 months in barrel, but the malolactic fermentation takes quite some time. And so we like to have that a little bit more of the age.
And you're doing all native. So it's, for wineries that are using commercial everything, it's kind of a lot faster.
Yes.
Native is a little bit more.
It will take a long time, right. But that's what we want, because anybody that's ever had like a really buttery Chardonnay, I mean, that can be achieved by trying to get it through malolactic really quickly, really warm fermentations, and so we just let it go naturally, just on its own pace. Some years will be different just based on the yeast that comes in with the fruit that year, or the chemistry of the fruit in any given year. So every year it'll be a little bit different. Sometimes you'll just have fermentations will finish up sooner, but we let it just do what it wants to do naturally.
The 2019 has a bit more minerality to it than the 2020, and the 2020 has a bit more body to it than the 19.
Yeah, and I like that we do take a little bit of the wine and put it in stainless steel in August, and then and so we'll blend that back in before bottling. And we did that we started doing that in 2020, and I think it gives also just a little touch of a nice reductive note. Not too much, but just right. A nice little.
That's a nice balancing act. That that reductiveness is beautiful in small. It's like that friend that is so loud that you love being with them, but in small doses.
Yeah, sometimes a reduction can just take over.
Right.
Wine,
right.
And you can't get anything out of it except for those reductive notes. So.
Right. I would say both of these, you can tell because of the body that's in there, you can tell that it's in oak, but it's not that overpowering butter and oakiness that we can see in some places. Yeah. But again, in terms of color wise, they're almost exactly the same. They both have they're a pale, like goldish with almost like a greenish hue to it. Like the aromatics are very different. They have the 19, like I said, is kind of like lemon curd, and minerality, where the 2020, and this is a strange thing to say, but by the aromatics, you can tell it's a fuller wine. Like it's a bigger, it's a bigger aromatics, and it's more there's like almost like the like an apple, it's not an apple pie, but that like that the essence of the spice that's in that apple pie, it's the flavors are too different, and that's probably has more to do with the vintages, the heat or the temperature or the climate of the vintage, but the aromatics have gone from like a greener to a riper in the 2020.
Yeah, and I think, and the other thing about the Chardonnays too is that they're going to age really beautifully.
The acid is the backbone to this one, to both of them are,
and that's really, and I mean, and that's all site driven, and the farming is really important. You can't just have a great terroir, you have to also have meticulous farming, and it doesn't matter, we did leafing, we did the canopy management, you have to do it at the right times in development. Anybody that's ever tried to grow, like have like a backyard garden, like I'm one of them, every year my husband and I are like, oh, what did we do wrong with the tomatoes this year? Like we should have pruned them or done this or that, because I mean, just left a tomato as a vine, just like a grapevine as a vine, and they just want to go crazy, they just want to keep being vines, and so you have to get them to focus on the fruit.
Absolutely.
It is an incredibly tricky and scientific thing that Todd, our winemaker, is really good at.
So Todd does the vineyard management also. You do not have a separate vineyard manager?
No.
Okay, so he's in both feet from the dirt to the bottle.
Yep. Yeah. And that's how he has always been. Well, one of his earliest winery positions was at Opus One, and he always says,
what a horrible resume.
I know. And Michael Salacci always said his employees have to work in both places. There isn't just vineyard and or winery separately. You have to have both. And so,
and I agree with that 100%. I get that some winemakers prefer to be in the winery, and there's some winemakers who really prefer to be in the vineyard, but it's the great winemakers that do both, because I don't think you can truly understand the grapes unless you're seeing them in the vineyard and how they act. We'll get into Pinot because that's even more, but I think Chardonnay is one of those grape varieties that is, no, I'm going to do what I want to do, right? And I think Chardonnay needs to be reined in a bit. Like it wants to go crazy in the vineyard, and it's somebody who's in the vineyard needs to know how to tame it down without shutting it down.
Yeah, and any great winemaker likes to have control over what they're doing, and Helen Turley told my dad from the very beginning, if you want to make world-class wine, you have to control your fruit sources. You have to be the one in control. So, there's a couple ways to do that. You could develop really great relationships with the growers you work with, and there are a lot of examples of that, but that's hard. There are not too many growers out there that care as much about your wine quality as they do about their bottom line.
Right.
And can you blame them? And so to have estate fruit makes such a big difference in wine. And then on top of that, to have the winemaker not battling with the vineyard manager, because when you're running a winery, a lot of times you'll find your winemaker and your winemaking team and your vineyard team at odds. And, so to have that alignment, or to just have one person calling all the shots, it's a recipe for, great things, great results.
Right. And now if we bring it back to the clones, okay, so you have, I'm whipping out a number because I was scanning through somewhere in the vicinity of like 7 Chardonnay clones, but like maybe 15 Pinot clones.
So a little bit less than that. We
Okay.
have 4 Chardonnay clones
Okay.
and 11
Oh,
Pinot
I was close with the Pinot.
Yeah. And so so the Pinot Noirs, and I'm sorry that you ended up getting 2 Chardonnays instead of a Chardonnay and a Pinot Noir, so you don't have anything to taste. But so with the Pinot Noirs, we make our estate Pinot Noir, which is a blend of all 11 clonal selections that we have planted. And so some wineries, or a lot of wineries, and and in Burgundy, it'll just be field blends or Massal selection. And what that means is basically, whatever's planted in the vineyard, you just go through and take your budwood and then just use that, whatever it may be, and then continue on, or when you're doing a replant, or when you're expanding your vineyard, or when you're planting a whole new vineyard. But what we did is we did it, and other wineries do what we do too. And so what they'll do, and what we did is we divide the vineyard into specific blocks, 1-acre blocks in our case, and we plant each block to a different clonal selection that we know what we've got. And and so we got them from different sources, though. Some we got from other vineyards, some we got from nurseries, some we have one clonal selection that's actually a suitcase clone that we got.
I was gonna say that, or a shoebox clone, right?
Exactly. And so Pinot Noir is really fascinating because more than any other wine grape variety, it has the ability to mutate based on where it is. And so what you end up with Pinot Noir is you have dozens and dozens of clonal selections to choose from. There are some that are that are better known in different regions. And anyways, in each of these, to make it extra confusing, though, you will have like Pommard is a common one. So obviously you have Pommard originating in Burgundy, but Pommard planted in one California vineyard versus a Pommard planted in an Oregon vineyard. You taste those wines and they taste completely different. So on top of having, the clones, well, it's part that goes hand in hand with the Pinot Noir's ability to mutate, is that it also takes on the character of where it's planted.
Big time, right?
And so, anyway, so Pinot Noir is kind of your wine geeks wine varietal for so many reasons, and that's just one of them. But so with the estate blend, we have this great complexity of clonal selections that we put together for that wine. And we make 5 other Pinot Noirs, all from just the one vineyard. And what they are block selections of a particular, of an individual clone or a blend of 2 clones. And so when you have the opportunity, which isn't, it's not very often that I have the opportunity where I'm opening up every one of our wines from a particular vintage, but there is a significant diversity in each Pinot Noir, just based on the block selection that it came from, even though it is all come from the one same 30-acre vineyard. And so that's really fun.
And so these clones, I'm going to assume, so tell me if I'm wrong, but the only way you can do this is you're harvesting each clone individually, you're keeping it separate, you're processing it all separately. And then for your estate, when it comes time for bottling, you're sampling each of these different barrels that you've maintained. And then you're choosing, I want this % from this barrel, this % from this barrel, and this is going to be my estate.
Exactly. And what we'll do is we'll actually put together the blend in March following harvest, and then let the wine, and then put it back into barrel, but we'll blend it all together and then put it back in the barrel. It's kind of like how, a soup always tastes better on the second night.
Right.
Let the wines get to know each other. So we'll make the blending decisions in March, and then put everything back, blend things, put them back in barrel, and then bottle them later on.
And I think that's a scary concept too, because as you're blending, you're doing everything with I call it unmarried, right? So you're doing it with this barrel and this barrel and this barrel, and you're trusting your palate to say, okay, these work well together, but now once wine gets blended, you can't unblend it, right? So now I've made my decision of what this blend is, and I'm going to put it together. And now you're hoping that that marriage of those barrels actually is a good marriage. And
yeah, and that it's going to continue like to be good. I mean, and that's where like my knowledge as a winery owner has to, or where my expertise stops, and then I have to trust my winemaker. And so a lot of times in the blending sessions, we'll have opinions about the wines, but there'll be four of us tasting the wines together. And we'll all have opinions about the wines. I mean, they're all good. We rarely outright reject anything, but ultimately the conclusion is, okay, he takes all of our feedback and comments about each wine, and then ultimately he makes the final call. But so many times we're split 50-50, and Todd, like if I was Todd, I'd be like, he loves it. He thinks it's great because I think it's a sense of validation, because here he has been in his office tasting, blend after blend after blend, tweaking, and he's going back and forth in his mind, and then I think he sees some validation, because then with all of us in the room tasting, we'll be going back and forth, and we'll all like different things. And so
he's proud he's creating options that are both phenomenal.
Yeah.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. And so with these clones that you have, well, first of all, let me ask, do you use all of your own fruit, or do you actually sell some of your fruit?
We use all of our own fruit. And we don't purchase any fruit.
Right. Okay. So you're not selling fruit at all. It's all for Wayfarer.
Yeah.
Okay. And then as you're going through these clones, do you have a favorite child?
It changes vintage to vintage. One wine that we always love is the Traveler, which is our suitcase clone. It's always really shy. It's not always the highest scored wine, because this wine is definitely the most ageable and the slowest to open up, both to the slowest to evolve in the bottle, but also the slowest to open up in the glass. But it is, it's just has an incredible range of just exotic aromatics, and the tannin quality and the length and the acidity are just stand out. And so always love that wine.
And how many Pinots are on your SKU? How many SKUs do you have for Pinot?
So we make 6 Pinot Noirs. So we make our estate wine, and then the other 5 are block selections. So the Traveler is one of them. And then we also have a second label called WF2, which is all estate. It's $45 a bottle, so it's half the price of our estate Pinot Noir. We make no money on it, but we bottle it for our customers because it's delicious, and it's great for the price, and it's just sort of it's a great wine to have that's not something special every night.
Right, absolutely. And so we're in the barrel room, and we've got our clones separated. So your Traveler, are you always looking for the similar components of those clones that are going in, or can one year, like if you've got all of these clones, I'm trying to figure out how you bottle what makes the difference between each of your 6 clones, 6 bottles.
Yeah, well, so when we bring in the fruit, it's all harvested block by block and kept separate. And
I'm sorry, each block is going to be its own separate clone.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. So each block is kept separate when it's harvested. And then every tank every block goes into its own tank. And then when the tanks are barreled down, those barrels are tracked, and the wine and the lots are kept separate. And so, but we have some, we have 30 blocks and 11 clones. So we have blocks, so we'll have the same clone in different blocks. And so the makeup, of one of our block selection cuvées, one year it could be more from one block and less from another block. It just depends on the year. But it's always the same clones.
Okay. And then did I ask this? Do you do a single clone?
Yeah, so two of our bottlings are single clones, so the Traveler, and then Pages Ridge is a Dijon 667 clone. So this is our most like California style, richest, if you will. We ferment it in a wood tank, as the clone just does so well with a little bit more oxygen in that tank, the wood tank influence early on. And then two other of our cuvées are a blend of two different clones. So Golden Mean is a blend of Pommard and Swan. And so the name Golden Mean comes from it means this beautiful middle between two opposites, because Pommard and Swan are truly opposites. Pommard is very earthy and structured and dense and spicy. And the Swan is very light and ethereal and floral and aromatic. And so we blend those two for the Golden Mean cuvée. And then the last cuvée is Mother Rock. And this is interesting because these, it's kind of happened by accident, because these blocks always ripen at the same time. They're always ready to be picked at the same time. And so the first vintage, that was one of the blocks that we just ended up co-fermenting, which means we put the two clones together and fermented them together in tank. And these two blocks are planted in the shallowest soil of the vineyard. And so the vine roots have gone down into the sandstone substrate, or the mother rock of the vineyard. And this wine just has a ton of intensity and minerality as a result. And so it's really unique for that reason.
That's awesome. And then in terms of what you recommend people to hold on to the Pinot, what is your tasting window recommendations?
I love drinking wines young, and like I love seeing what they are. You can always decant wines, and so I always advocate for trying them young. But then for great bottles of wine, you always want to buy a few, drink a couple younger, and then drink them as they age. But I think 5 to 8 years is another beautiful period to drink the wines. And we're constantly looking at our winemaking and tasting older vintages and just trying to improve year after year. And so part of that is also to improve the ageability and see, how these wines evolve over time. And so we're constantly learning and trying to improve, but there are some of our cuvées that have aged really beautifully for 10 years.
And for the Chardonnays, I think both of the Chardonnay in general, I think unless you're in Burgundy, people kind of think, you got to drink Chardonnay relatively quickly.
Yeah.
And the structure to these Chardonnays, definitely these can sit also. These are definitely ageable Chardonnays.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think, depending on the vintage, some of our Chardonnays are beautiful 10 years down the road. But certainly like 5 years is a wonderful sweet spot for the Chardonnays as well.
Absolutely. And now where can people find Wayfarer? How do they find you?
So we are on our website. You can order our wines. The block selections are allocated to join our mailing list. But the estate wines, the Chardonnay and the Pinot Noir, and our WF2 wines, our second label, those are all available just at wayfarervineyard.com. And then we also have distribution around the country. It's harder to find wines in your local retail stores, but since COVID, more and more restaurants are coming back and ordering, and so that's been a great thing to see as well.
And what about is your average case production?
Yeah, so we make about 4,000 cases of wine a year in total. The estate Pinot Noir and the estate Chardonnay are each around 1,000 cases of each, and the other wines are smaller.
And can they come visit you?
We do private tastings actually at my family's home in Napa.
Okay.
And so just by reaching out to us, our email address is on our website, and we are more than happy to host tastings. We also, if you are adventurous and want to go out and see the vineyard, we try to accommodate any requests we get to go out and see the vineyard. And Todd will generally host those.
Do they need to show up in like a VW van?
Yeah, yeah, with the tie-dye curtains.
Right.
Yeah.
That would be so much fun, I think, right?
Yeah. Oh my gosh, yeah. Yeah, it's definitely a long and winding road, but it's one of the most beautiful and dramatic wine growing regions, I would venture to say, in the world. I mean, it's truly wild and rural and beautiful. And so definitely a place to visit, especially if you love wine.
And does Todd live in that area, or?
He lives in the Santa Rosa area.
Oh, so he's got a little drive.
I think 90 minutes from the vineyard. I live in Napa actually, so I'm 2.5 hours from the vineyard. But yeah, Todd makes that drive 3 or 4 times a week for most of the year. So it's a lot of dedication.
A little bit of miles on that vehicle.
Yep.
And then you are also on social media?
Yes, at Wayfarer Vineyard on Instagram. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate you taking the time out to share these wines with me. And I will have to try to get my hands on some of that Pinot. Very cool I love the whole clone concept.
Yes, I'll be sure to send you a bottle.
Thank you. The whole clone concept, I love it because I try to explain to people there's clones in pretty much every grape variety there is, because it's just a natural mutation. And but certain grape Pinot and Chardonnay, and mostly Pinot, like that's the thing about Pinot, right? Is all of those mutations, like Cab Franc has clones also, but you don't ever hear people saying, oh, well, I'm going to bottle this clone, or I'm going to bottle this clone, or whatever. But Pinot Noir, you have very specific clones that people follow. It's like cult followings for a specific clone.
Oh, yeah.
And you're absolutely right. That same clone is very different in 2 completely different regions, and that plays to the role of what Pinot is. And I think Chardonnay is actually the second, like, known for clones. And you do have the Wente, which is and I don't know if there's more than one. There's probably more than one Wente.
There's lots of different old Wente clones. Okay. So yeah.
Yeah. And each one has its own little character that you can fall in love with. Absolutely. And that I'll just end with, I have a very big issue with people who say if something comes from a single vineyard, it cannot be complex. And that is so not true. And these wines definitely demonstrate that it's, if you're taking from a single vineyard and it cannot be complex, but that's because the vineyard manager isn't paying attention to the actual vineyard.
Well, the greatest wines of the world come from single vineyard bottlings. That's just a fact.
Right. Absolutely. I don't know where the Americans get this concept that you can't have that. Yeah. But this definitely disproves that, or disproves that myth, proves that myth is wrong. However it is.
I know what you mean.
Yeah. So these are beautiful wines, and thank you so much for sharing them with me and for taking time out. And I'll raise my glass and say sláinte, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Lori.
Special. You are so special, even in the Bible.
This has been another episode of Exploring the Wine Glass. Thanks for listening. If you have suggestions on what topics you would like me to discuss, please reach out on social media. You can find me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook as Exploring the Wine Glass. I am also on LinkedIn as Lori Hoyt-Budd. Of course, you can always email me at exploringthewineglass@gmail.com and sign up for my newsletter at exploringthewineglass.com. If you enjoyed what you heard, please rate, review, and subscribe to help others find me more easily. And most importantly, tell your wine-loving friends, because if you like the podcast, they will too. Podcast music is Wine by Kevins. Until next week, Slancha.
I want a nice glass right now. I'm on keeping for my 10,000 tell you. There is always time for a good glass of wine. No, no, no. Oh, no, no, no. Never let you go. Oh, oh. No, no, no. Never let you go. I want a nice glass right now.